But it's something much more serious that Labor doesn't want to talk about at all, and it's going to affect all of us. It's becoming very clear now that our global warming politicians, including Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, are destroying our electricity system without having anything workable to replace it. I mean, next month's jump in electricity prices, another 20 to 25%, can you believe? It's just a taste of what's coming. Now, the latest sign of trouble is our new mad global warming scheme in Victoria. It's crumbling. Now, we've had lots of government-backed global warming schemes collapse already, of course. There was the geothermal power plant that was backed by Kevin Rudd that collapsed. The wave generators backed by Labor that sank. Malcolm Turnbull's bogged Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro scheme that's looking now to cost anything up to 10 times more than promised if it ever gets finished. But this latest green scheme could be the most dangerous yet. It's the State Electricity Commission promised by Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews at last year's state election. Now, last week, I've heard, we learned that Dr. Alan Finkel, Australia's former chief scientist, had quietly quit as, the gee-whiz high-profile advisor to this new SEC. Personal reasons, he said, although in February he did express worries about what was going on, how this thing would work. But more than that, it's now clear that the promises Daniel Andrews made last year, like cheaper power prices from his SEC, they're trash. Now, that SEC was Andrews' signature promise at last November's state election. He campaigned in jackets and pullovers with an SEC logo, promising to bring back this once sold off state authority and making big promises, incredible promises.
A re-elected Labor government has a plan to bring back the SEC. 51% ownership by the Victorian taxpayer, and we will look to super funds as our preferred investment partner for the other 49%.
I mean, it was all incredible. This SEC, he said, was finally going to make Victoria's wind and solar power, essentially replace coal-fired power by 2035. There you go. And all that Andrews would have to pay was just $1 billion, at least that's the seed money, to replace the 4.5 gigawatts of power from the giant Loy Yang A coal-fired power station when it closes by 2035. Like most of Australia's coal generators, by the way, be scared. And all this, Andrews promised after the election too, would cut power prices. Cut power prices. It was nuts, as I said at the time. I mean, think about it. Voters are being asked to believe that super funds would somehow be glad to hand over Andrews' SEC, to this spendthrift government, their money without having majority control of the SEC. They'd be happy to get just modest profits, nothing big from this. Voters were asked to believe that all that 4.5 gigawatts of wind and solar power that he was going to create, power that vanishes when the sun stops shining and the wind stops blowing, that would be enough to make up for the loss of the same amount of coal-fired power that actually runs 24/7. And they were asked to believe all this could be done with $1 billion, just $1 billion. You'd have to be an idiot to believe any of it, and sadly, many of voters did. Mind you, people are still now believing Federal Energy Minister Chris Bowen, aren't they? His crazy promises to run Australia's electricity grid on 83% renewable energy in just 7 years. Oh yeah, sure. But today, brutal reality is setting in about Andrews' SEC, which is a taste of their federal future. And Alan Finkel leaving is just one sign of strife. For instance, this new SEC's interim boss, Chris Miller, last week admitted, well, it still hadn't found its first project. As investment in green power, it's drying up. In fact, around the country, not one renewable energy generation project reached a final investment decision in the March quarter. 3 months, no decision, not one. But Miller admitted to more than, the build-out of renewable power to replace all this coal-fired stuff that's closing is way behind. He also said that $1 billion, of course, wouldn't be enough to replace Loy Yang A. They'd need more from other investors. He also said, no, Andrews' new green SEC is not necessarily going to give lower prices at all. They can actually go up. Daniel Andrews sold voters a fraud. Because, of course, power bills are going to soar. Because politicians lie when they say renewables are cheaper. The problem is quite fundamental. Green power actually means building 2 electricity systems instead of 1. Sure, a wind farm looks cheap, driven by all that free air, but you have to build new transmission wires for a start, so all those new wind and solar farms. That's an estimated 10,000 kilometres of lines we've got to build over just 7 years. And that involves compensating angry farmers along the way. Compensation which has now soared to up to $400,000 per kilometre. Calculate. And most importantly, you need another power system in the background to take over from renewables when there's no wind or sun. The cost is horrendous. The Australian Energy Market Operator estimates replacing fossil fuels would actually cost around $320 billion by 2050. $320 billion. And who do you think is going to have to pay that back? And the cost may not even be the worst of it. The Australian Energy Market Operator last week warned we're actually running way behind in replacing the coal-fired power generators. We're driving out of business. There's a shortage of workers, material, money. Is that our future? Paying a fortune to end up without enough electricity? And all to stop what I've argued is a fake global warming crisis. Joining me is economist Judith Sloan. She's been Productivity Commissioner, Company Director, Professor, now an economics commentator for the Australian newspaper, where she's covered this slow destruction of our electricity system. Judith Sloan, great to see you again. Victoria's new State Electricity Commission, set up by Daniel Andrews to run the state on green power, in just 10 years, drive down prices, a bit more than 10 years. How much trouble is it in?
Well, Andrew, it was always a complete stunt. And the thing is, people should have known it, and it should have been much more widely broadcast at the time. I mean, $1 billion of capital, given the kind of figures you just quoted about the required investment to, get to net zero and become totally reliant on renewable energy with backup. I mean, $1 billion doesn't, hit the side of the cup. And of course, they have to remain the majority owner, 51%. As you say, what private investor, including the superannuation funds, want to be part of this game when one of the explicit objectives is to lower prices, in other words, to have lower returns. Now, I think we're in real trouble in Victoria. I mean, you talk about Loy Yang, but actually one of the more immediate threats is that in 2028, which is not very far away, the Yallourn power station will close. Now, at the moment, we don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars the Victorian government is shelling out to Energy Australia to keep Yallourn going. I've tried very, very hard, and you know me, Andrew, I can be a bit of a terrier, but it's absolutely impossible to find out how much money they're handing over to that company to keep that brown coal-fired power station, Yallourn, going. But 2028 is coming down the pike, and so we've got real problems. But here's the other interesting thing. So Victoria's quite a small place, right? It doesn't have a really super big landmass. And so what they've realised is that the landmass required for solar and wind is such that we would have to take over 70% of land currently used for agriculture if we wanted to get to their, I think it's 2035, they've got a target. Now, that ain't going to happen, right? So what they've decided to do, the brainiacs there in Spring Street, that they've decided to go offshore, right? So I think they've established a renewable zone down in Gippsland, and I think there might be one now down towards Portland and Warrnambool, that area. The trouble with that is that they're hideously expensive, those offshore turbines. You know, they're like between 4 and 10 times an onshore turbine. And here's the thing, you need a specific kind of ship to be able to lodge the turbine in the ocean with all the required cement and the like. And there's a worldwide shortage of those ships. So, you know, it's all dream stuff, really. And I mean, you know, and I mean, I felt really disgusted
Judith, that makes me,
the SEC.
when you say Judith, you called this out, a number of people called this out. What annoys me, what angers me, is that it is such nonsense, but the Victorian Liberal opposition was so gutless about challenging, any green scheme, as are so many Liberals around the country, that it didn't even dare question this during the election. But look, this is Victoria. Most of Australia knows that Victoria's rather mad now. But what does this one example here tell us about the whole national push to green power, particularly the Albanese government's plan to run our electricity grid on 83% renewable energy in just 7 years' time?
Well, I mean, that is all just not going to happen, and they really have to move quite quickly. So let me give you a few figures. So they estimate that by 2030 we need 10,000 kilometres of additional transmission lines, right? Now, leave aside the costs, right? And you have mentioned that the costs are escalating, which are ultimately paid by electricity consumers. We'll be lucky to construct 500 to 600 kilometres a year. So we need 10,000 by 2030, 500 to 600 a year. We are not going to get there. Eraring, the largest coal-fired power plant in New South Wales, due to close in 2025, generates between 20 and 25% of electricity in that state. That cannot be allowed to close. So we are really, I think, beginning to edge towards the cliff here. But, Bowen seems to still like the vibe, if you know what I mean. But, vibes eventually hit the wall. I don't see him pulling
his head in. Judith, this is frightening me. That man is so cocksure about something that's fallen to pieces in. And, we're all going to pay higher power prices and we won't actually have reliable electricity in return. It's just extraordinary. Judith Sloan, I urge people to read what you have been writing in the Australian. Follow it, because you've been right on top of this. And it staggers me that politicians aren't waking up and trying to save us from what's coming. Thank you so much for your time.